Could Benedict continue to be the Pope on into 2013, 2014? Well, anything's possible, but it's not probable. And the prophecies, definitely, of occult sources have said that it's going to happen in the year 2012. It's not just the prophecy of the popes. We talked in that last broadcast about the Zohar. 700 years ago, Jewish priests, Orthodox priests, prophesying when their Messiah would appear. And they said it in the year 5773 in the Jewish calendar, which in our Gregorian calendar begins in the new moon this September. Now imagine that. 700 years ago, they prophesied when their Messiah would appear, and they said it for September of 2012. But given the fact that they rejected Jesus as their Messiah, Christians would understand their prophecy as heralding the arrival of the Antichrist, right, in the year 2012. And so then of course, we talked about all the other things. The Mayan calendar ends in 2012. The Aztec calendar ends in 2012. The Cherokee Indian ends in 2012. Mayan inscriptions in 2 different places. They just found a new one where it talks about the Mayan underworld god Bolan Yakteku, which actually sounds like an alien invasion because it talks about all these motherships or whatever, these what's called support gods, but these giant things descending very quickly to the earth. That's in the Mayan inscriptions. That's going to happen in the year 2012. The Hindu Kali Yuga calendar ends in the year 2012. And then we talked about how Jonathan Edwards, America's most important original philosophical theologian, the greatest intellectual, how he predicted 2 things. Really, that the Antichrist will appear in the year 2012, but he will break his covenant with the Jews in 2016. So now all of a sudden we have 2 dates that appear to be important. One is 2012, one is 2016. And there's a lot of stuff we didn't talk about in the last show that's related to that. For instance, June 21, 2016 is exactly 3.5 years, the midst of the week, after the end of the Mayan ending date, December 21st, 2012. But that's the same date that marks the summer solstice in the northern hemisphere and the winter solstice in the southern hemisphere, when a cusp line is created between Gemini and Cancer. And if you read David Oveson's book, The Secret Architect of Our Nation's Capital, he refers to that date as having very deep astrological significance to the founding and the secret destiny of America. So there's a great deal more here. Also really important to recognize that based on Daniel chapter 9 and the related text, scholars believe that a period of 70 years, or a biblical generation, will elapse between the reformation of Israel as a nation and the return of Jesus Christ. Well, guess what, ladies and gentlemen? When 70 years is added to 1948, the year that Israel was formally recognized as an independent nation by the United States, it brings us through the year 2018, which means that the year 2019, exactly 7 years after 2012, would mark the year that Jesus Christ returns with the armies of heaven to establish his rule over the earth. So is all of this, what is all of this, Steve? I mean, there seems to be a concatenation of events that are unfolding, that are involved with the year 2012, that are mathematically impossible. Now, I'm not a mathematician, but I understand simple stuff like, 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times. There's a point where pretty soon you hit the exponential curve, and those numbers, those probabilities go into the stratosphere, and we've only scratched the surface. If you read the book Apollyon Rising 2012, you find out that actually the most remarkable connection, the year 2012 for me in that book, was how the Maya directly linked the years 1776 and 2000.
Hey, Tom,
yes.
Tom, hold on. Something's garbling you. Could you repeat that? You just garbled really bad.
You did earlier, too, so I sound okay
Steve
now?
And, Tom, it's probably at our end, Steve. What I need to do is refresh the Skype connection.
Okay.
Everything is going on tape, though, so there'll be no garbling there.
Okay.
Tom, why don't we do this? If you all will both give me exactly 2 minutes, that'll allow me to refresh the connection.
Okay.
And Steve,
You want
I'm
to
going
take
to dial
a?
you
It's
right
the,
back.
it's
Yeah,
the
let's
top
just
of
take
the
a
hour at
break.
10. You want to
Yeah,
just
let's
take a break?
You know, hey, perfect timing. It's right on the money. So let's take a break. And
Okay.
Steve, I'll dial you back. We'll be back in about 5 or 6 minutes, folks. If you're just tuning in, you're listening to Omega Man Radio. We'll be right back.
Well, Tom, before we went and got interrupted by the breakdown in Skype or whatever, you were. I want to give you the time to finish out your thought. It didn't seem like we were there.
Well, I think I was getting on kind of a roll. You know, that's happened when you get anointed, that old saying, it's amazing what you'll say when you get anointed. But much of the research in Apollyon Rising 2012, that's the point that I was going to make, is kind of like part one of Petros Romanus. If you read the book Petros Romanus, and if you have read the book Apollyon Rising 2012, you'll kind of see the connection between part one and part two, in that this book, in many ways, of course, it breaks a lot of fresh new ground, but in many ways it kind of picks up where we left off in that book. But the most remarkable connection to the year 2012 in the book Apollyon Rising 2012 was how the Maya had recognized that there was a direct link between the 2 years, 1776 and 2012, in a way that, if you will recall, Steve, you and I talked about this a couple of years ago, that Richard Luxton, who was the academic that had interpreted the Book of the Kumiel, the council book of the Yucatec Maya, from the 1500s, it was what he put in his personal notations on Katun 13 Ehu. He wrote this, and I grabbed it while we were on this break. He wrote this. He wrote, quote, "The dates that accompany the illustrations approximate real counts. Katun 13 Ehu began in the colonial count 1776, and the end of the Eastern Katun cycle in 13 Ehu is intermingled here with elements of the Christian Last Judgment. Whether this paradigm was also intended for the end of the long count in 2012 is open to question," end quote. And when I first found that years ago, I found that that statement is what then caused me to begin communicating to different Bible scholars and asking them, do you know of any direct connection between the Great Seal of the United States of America and the year 2012? And the reason I was asking that is when I saw this connection between 1776 and 2012 and the 13-stepped countdown, the Katun 13 Ehu, immediately what happened was the Great Seal of the United States jumped into my mind, where at the base of a 13-stepped pyramid you have the year 1776, over which is hovering the all-seeing eye of Apollo. Now, we're not going to talk about that. By the way, if people want to know more about that and that conversation, Steve Quayle and I did, I forget how many hours on that very subject. It is still over there on the website ApollionRising.com or ApollionRising2012.com. And if you go over there, you'll find the website that Steve and I did. And what's ironic, Steve, is there's a quote down there from David Flynn talking about how he thought it was one of the best shows he had ever heard. So isn't that ironic? But people can go over there and they can listen all about that and find out all about that. But the point I was making before the break is that there's something super unusual about 2012, and most people really don't get it. I mean, they think that it just has something to do with the end of the Mayan calendar. That's really just a freckle on the blueprint of what's really unfolding, and how many different ancient societies, some of which we mentioned before the break, some of which we could talk about at some other point, but in addition to that, consider that in 2012 the United States will elect a new president, hopefully a new one, maybe re-elect the same one. And Michael Savage says if we re-elect Obama, it'll be our last president. In 2012, the United Nations gets new leaders. 2012, Petros Romanus is supposed to materialize. It wasn't also, by the way, it wasn't just Jonathan Edwards, but there were other early century writers like Reverend William J. Reed, who something like 130 or 40 years ago wrote his book, Lectures on the Revelation, concerning the papal system, and he wrote, we are prepared to answer the question, when will the papal system come to an end? It will be destroyed in the year 2012. So what in the world, Steve? Why were so many individuals, most of them of an occultic nature, these others like Jonathan Edwards and Reverend Reed and others of Christians who would have been inspired by the Holy Spirit, why were they so fixated that in the year 2012 several things were going to happen? One, there would be distress among the nations. Secondly, there would be the coming of a messianic figure, the Antichrist, a false Christ who would appear, the arrival of the false prophet, and by the way, many of these cultures, on a different subject you and I have also covered numerous times, also talked about this being followed by the emergence of a new enlightened form of humanity. And when you look at, for instance, the prophecy of the Cumae Sibyl, the Novus Ordo Seclorum on the Great Seal of the United States, she specifically talks about a new golden age in which once again the gods will be commingled with mankind. She's talking about a reintroduction of Watcher/Nephilim/Gibborim activity happening upon the earth. And if you read Apollyon Rising 2012, you'll see that that's dated to occur in the year 2012. Then you have Rene Thibault, the code breaker, saying that it's going to happen in the year 2012. Anyway, the list is spooky. It's not just the Maya. They're only one small part of a much bigger picture that goes back into thousands of years of occult societies, looking forward to one event horizon, Steve, and they targeted the year 2012 in a way that's, I agree with the professor that interpreted the book of the Kumiel, Richard, that it seems to smack of the Christian final judgment prophecies, the book of Revelation, the books of Daniel, the prophetic texts that tell us a time would come when a false prophet would appear, a false Christ would appear. The world is going to accept them as their messianic figure. The non-religious will just see them as heroes, if you will, political figures who are going to solve all of our issues. Religious people are going to accept them, and it is going to be both the Islamic community and the Vatican, the Catholic community, and much of the evangelical community. They are going to accept this individual as their coming Messiah. Now, the thing I loved about David Flynn is where a guy like me could do a tremendous amount of research, and I'm blessed to have people that I can, put on task to do research for me. And I hope that it doesn't sound like what I'm saying is my research is superficial. But compared to David Flynn, a lot of people's research is superficial. Because what Flynn did was he looked past the surface information. He looked past even these various occult sources and societies to find what was the source of the Mayan, the Aztec, the etc. Where was their knowledge coming from? Which then also would tie to the true source of the ET, UFO, abduction phenomenon, information coming out of the Vatican. But what's really behind it? I think that's one of the things that really drove him is what is the source, right? Where's it coming from? Who's inspiring all of this? So somebody prophesied. So what? What was behind it? And you may have read recently one of the entries on Raiders News Update into the Petrus Romanus series. And by the way, you said a moment ago, Steve, that chapter 17 was up. Well, actually, these are not the chapters in the book. This is just a lot of material based on research in the book.
Right, and I apologize for that. I was excuse me. I'm glad you made that clear because, again, you do this typically when you bring out a book. You put so much cool information that I call that wetting the whistle stops.
Well, a lot of it is because you'd be amazed how many people email us and they'll say something like, I can't even afford to buy the book. So we try to put just a ton of information out there that can help people. On the other hand, the Lord has instructed us to be good stewards, and I have people whose life depends on me being able to pay their salary. So there also is a stage at which I have to be able to function. You've probably heard these people in the past that have said, well, if you were really a man of God, you'd just give it all away free. And the answer to that is, yeah, I'd do that for a few weeks, and then everybody that works for me and depends on me and myself, we'd be bankrupt